Section 9 of Tales of Space and Time by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Story of the Days to Come, Part 2, The Vacant Country. The world, they say, changed more between the year 1800 and the year 1900 than it had done in the previous 500 years. That century, the 19th century, was the dawn of a new epoch in the history of mankind. The epoch of the great cities, the end of the old order of country life. In the beginning of the 19th century, the majority of mankind still lived upon the countryside, as their way of life had been for countless generations. All over the world they dwelt in little towns and villages, then, and engaged either directly in agriculture or in occupations that were of service to the agriculturalist. They traveled rarely and dwelt close to their work, because swift means of transit had not yet come. The few who traveled went either on foot or in slow sailing ships, or by means of jogging horses incapable of more than 60 miles a day. Think of it, 60 miles a day. Here and there, in those sluggish times, the town grew a little larger than its neighbors, as a port or as a center of government. But all the towns in the world with more than 100,000 inhabitants could be counted on a man's fingers. So it was in the beginning of the 19th century. By the end, the invention of railways, telegraphs, steamships, and complex agricultural machinery had changed all these things, changed them beyond all hope of return. The vast shops, the varied pleasures, the countless conveniences of the larger towns were suddenly possible, and no sooner existed than they were brought into competition with the homely resources of the rural centers. Mankind were drawn to the cities by an overwhelming attraction. The demand for labor fell with the increase of machinery. The local markets were entirely superseded, and there was a rapid growth of the larger centers at the expense of the open country. The flow of population townward was the constant preoccupation of Victorian writers. In Great Britain and New England, in India and China, the same thing was remarked. Everywhere, a few swollen towns were visibly replacing the ancient order. That this was an inevitable result of improved means of travel and transport, that given swift means of transit, these things must be, was realized by few, and the most puerile schemes were devised to overcome the mysterious magnetism of the urban centers and keep the people on the land. Yet the developments of the 19th century were only the dawning of the new order. The first great cities of the new time were horribly inconvenient, darkened by smoky fogs, insanitary and noisy. But the discovery of new methods of building, new methods of heating, changed all this. Between 1900 and 2000, the march of change was still more rapid, and between 2000 and 2100, the continual acceleration of progress of human invention made the reign of Victoria the Good seem at last an almost incredible vision of idyllic, tranquil days. The introduction of railways was only the first step in that development of those means of locomotion which finally revolutionized human life. By the year 2000, railways and roads had vanished altogether. The railways, robbed of their rails, had become weedy ridges and dishes upon the face of the world. The old roads, strange barbaric tracks of flint and soil, hammered by hand or rolled by rough iron rollers, strewn with miscellaneous filth, and cut by iron hoofs and wheels into ruts and puddles often many inches deep, had been replaced by patent tracks made of a substance called edamite. This edamite, it was named after its patentee, ranks with the invention of printing and steam as one of the epoch-making discoveries of the world's history. When Adam discovered the substance, he probably thought of it as a mere cheap substitute for India rubber. It cost a few shillings a ton. but you can never tell all an invention will do. It was the genius of a man named Warming that pointed to the possibility of using it, not only for the tires of the wheels, but as a road substance, and who organized the enormous network of public ways that speedily covered the world. These public ways were made with longitudinal divisions. On the outer and either side went foot cyclists and conveyances traveling at a less speed than 25 miles an hour. In the middle, motors capable of speed up to 100, and the inner, Warming, in the face of enormous ridicule, reserved for vehicles traveling at speeds of 100 miles an hour and upward. For 10 years his inner ways were vacant. Before he died, they were the most crowded of all, and vast light frameworks with wheels 20 and 30 feet in diameter hurled along them at paces that year after year rose steadily towards 200 miles an hour. And by the time this revolution was accomplished, a parallel revolution had transformed the ever-growing cities. Before the development of practical science, the fogs and filth of Victorian times vanished. Electric heating replaced fires. In 2013, the lighting of a fire that did not absolutely consume its own smoke was made an indictable nuisance. And all the city ways, all public squares and places, were covered in with a recently invented glass-like substance. The roofing of London became practically continuous. Certain short-sighted and foolish legislation against tall buildings was abolished, and London, from a squat expanse of petty houses, feebly archaic in design, rose steadily towards the sky. To the municipal responsibility for water, light, and drainage was added another, and that was ventilation. But to tell of all the changes in human conveniences that these 200 years brought about, to tell of the long-foreseen invention of flying, to describe how life in households was steadily supplanted by life in the interminable hotels, how at last even those who were still concerned in agricultural work came to live in the towns and go to and fro to their work every day, to describe how at last in all England only 4 towns remained, each with many millions of people, and how there were left no inhabited houses in all the countryside. To tell all this would take us far from our story of Denton and his Elizabeth. They had been separated and reunited, and still they could not marry, for Denton, it was his only fault, had no money. Neither had Elizabeth until she was 21, and as yet she was only 18. At 21, all the property of her mother would come to her, for that was the custom of the time. She did not know that it was possible to anticipate her fortune, and Denton was too far delicate a lover to suggest such a thing. So things stuck hopelessly between them. Elizabeth said that she was very unhappy, and that nobody understood her but Denton, and that when she was away from him she was wretched, and Denton said that his heart longed for her day and night, and they met as often as they could to enjoy the discussion of their sorrows. They met one day at their little seat upon the flying stage. The precise site of this meeting was where in Victorian times the road from Wimbledon came out upon the common. They were, however, 500 feet above that point. Their seat looked far over London. To convey the appearance of it all to a 19th century reader would have been difficult. One would have had to tell him to think of the Crystal Palace, of the newly built Mammoth Hotels, as those little affairs were called, of the larger railway stations of his time, and to imagine such buildings enlarged to vast proportions and run together and continuous over the whole metropolitan area. If then he was told that this continuous roof space bore a huge forest of rotating wind wheels, he would have begun very dimly to appreciate what to these young people was the commonest sight in their lives. To their eyes it had something of the quality of a prison, and they were talking, as they had talked 100 times before, of how they might escape from it and be at last happy together, escape from it, that is, before the appointed 3 years were at an end. It was, they both agreed, not only impossible, but almost wicked to wait 3 years. Before that, said Denton, and the notes of his voice told of a splendid chest, we might both be dead. Their vigorous young hands had the grip at this, and then Elizabeth had a still more poignant thought that brought the tears from her wholesome eyes down her healthy cheeks. One of us, she said, one of us might be. She choked. She could not say the word that is so terrible to the young and happy. Yet to marry and be very poor in the cities of that time was, for anyone who had lived pleasantly, a very dreadful thing. In the old agricultural days that had drawn to an end in the 18th century, there had been a pretty proverb of love in a cottage, and indeed in those days the poor of the countryside had dwelt in flower-covered, diamond-windowed cottages of thatch and plaster, with the sweet air and the earth about them, amidst tangled hedges and the song of birds, and with ever-changing sky overhead. But all this had changed. The change was already beginning in the 19th century, and a new sort of life was opening for the poor in the lower quarters of the city. In the 19th century, the lower quarters were still beneath the sky. They were areas of land on clay or other unsuitable soil, liable to floods or exposed to the smoke of more fortunate districts, insufficiently supplied with water, and as insanitary as the great fear of infectious diseases felt by the wealthier classes permitted. In the 22nd century, however, the growth of the city story above story and the coalescence of buildings had led to a different arrangement. The prosperous people lived in vast series of sumptuous hotels in the upper stories and halls of the city fabric. The industrial population dwelt beneath in the tremendous ground floor and basement, so to speak, of the place. In the refinement of life and manners, these lower classes differed little from their ancestors, the East Enders of Queen Victoria's time, but they had developed a distinct dialect of their own. In these underways they lived and died, rarely ascending to the surface except when work took them there, since for most of them this was the sort of life to which they had been born. They found no great misery in such circumstances, but for people like Denton and Elizabeth, such a plunge would have seemed more terrible than death. "And yet what else is there?" asked Elizabeth. Denton professed not to know. Apart from his own feeling of delicacy, he was not sure how Elizabeth would like the idea of borrowing on the strength of her expectations. The passage from London to Paris even, said Elizabeth, was beyond their means, and in Paris, as in any other city in the world, life would be just as costly and impossible as London. Well might Denton cry aloud, "If only we had lived in those days, dearest! If only we had lived in the past!" For to their eyes, even 19th century Whitechapel was seen through a mist of romance. "Is there nothing?" cried Elizabeth, suddenly weeping. "Must we really wait for those 3 long years? Fancy 3 years, 36 months. The human capacity for patience had not grown with the ages." Then suddenly Denton was moved to speak of something that had already flickered across his mind. He had hit upon it at last. It seemed to him so wild a suggestion that he made it only half seriously. But to put a thing into words has ever a way of making it seem more real and possible than it seemed before. And so it was with him. "Suppose," he said, "we went into the country." She looked at him to see if he was serious in proposing such an adventure. "To the country?" "Yes, beyond there, beyond the hills." "How could we live?" she said. "Where could we live?" "It is not impossible," he said. "People used to live in the country." "But then there were houses." "There are the ruins of villages and towns now. On the clay lands they are gone, of course, but there is still left on the grazing land because it does not pay the food company to remove them. I know that for certain. Besides, one sees them from the flying machines, you know. Well, we might shelter in some one of these and repair it with our hands. Do you know, the thing is not so wild as it seems. Some of the men who go out every day to look after the crops and herds might be paid to bring us food." She stood in front of him. How strange it would be if one really could. "Why not?" "But no one dares." "That is no reason. It would be, oh, it would be so romantic and strange if only it were possible." "Why not possible?" "There are so many things. Think of all the things we have, things that we should miss." "Should we miss them? After all, the life we lead is very unreal, very artificial." He began to expand his idea, and as he warmed to his exposition, the fantastic quality of his first proposal faded away. She thought, "But I have heard of prowlers, escaped criminals." He nodded. He hesitated over his answer because he thought it sounded boyish. He blushed. "I could get someone I know to make me a sword." She looked at him with enthusiasm growing in her eyes. She had heard of swords, had seen one in a museum. She thought of those ancient days when men wore them as a common thing. His suggestion seemed an impossible dream to her, and perhaps for that reason she was eager for more detail. And inventing, for the most part as he went along, he told her how they might live in the country as the old world people had done. With every detail her interest grew, for she was one of those girls for whom romance and adventure had a fascination. His suggestion seemed, I say, an impossible dream to her on that day, but the next day they talked about it again, and it was strangely less impossible. "At first we should take food," said Denton. "We could carry food for 10 or 12 days." It was an age of compact, artificial nourishment, and such a provision had none of the unwieldy suggestion it would have had in the 19th century. "But until our house," she asked, "until it was ready, where should we sleep?" "It is summer." "But what do you mean?" "There was a time when there were no houses in the world, when all mankind slept always in the open air." "But for us, the emptiness, no walls, no ceiling." "Dear," he said, "in London you have many beautiful ceilings. Artists paint them and stud them with lights. But I have seen a ceiling more beautiful than any in London." "But where?" "It is the ceiling under which we two would be alone." "You mean?" "Dear," he said, "it is something the world has forgotten. It is heaven and all the host of stars." Each time they talked, the thing seemed more possible and more desirable to them. In a week or so it was quite possible. Another week, and it was the inevitable thing they had to do. A great enthusiasm for the country seized hold of them and possessed them. The sordid tumult of the town, they said, overwhelmed them. They marveled that this simple way out of their troubles had never come upon them before. One morning, near Midsummer Day, there was a new minor official upon the flying stage, and Denton's place was to know him no more. Our two young people had secretly married, and were going forth manfully out of the city in which they and their ancestors before them had lived all their days. She wore a new dress of white, cut in an old-fashioned pattern, and he had a bundle of provisions strapped athwart his back, and in his hand he carried, rather shamefacedly it is true, and under his purple cloak, an implement of archaic form, a cross-hilted thing of tempered steel. Imagine that going forth. In their days, the sprawling suburbs of Victorian times, with their vile roads, petty houses, foolish little gardens of shrub and geranium, and all their futile, pretentious privacies had disappeared. The towering buildings of the new age, the mechanical ways, the electric and water mains, all came to an end together like a wall, like a cliff, near 400 feet in height, abrupt and sheer. And all about the city spread the carrot, swede, and turnip fields of the food company, vegetables that were the basis of 1,000 varied foods, and weeds and hedgerow tangles had been utterly extirpated. The incessant expense of weeding that went on year after year in the petty, wasteful, and barbaric farming of the ancient days, the food company had economized forevermore by a campaign of extermination. Here and there, however, neat rows of brambles, standards, and apple trees with whitewashed stems intersected the fields, and at places groups of gigantic teasels reared their favored spikes. Here and there huge agricultural machines hunched under waterproof covers. The mingled waters of the Wey and Mole and Wandle ran in rectangular channels, and wherever a gentle elevation of the ground permitted, a fountain of deodorized sewage distributed its benefits athwart the land and made a rainbow of the sunlight. By a great archway in that enormous city wall emerged the Edomite road to Portsmouth, swarming in the morning sunshine with an enormous traffic, bearing the blue-clad servants of the food company to their toil. A rushing traffic, besides which they seemed two scarce moving dots. Along the outer tracks hummed and rattled the tardy little old-fashioned motors of such as had duties within 20 miles or so of the city. The inner ways were filled with vast mechanisms, swift monocycles bearing a score of men, lank multicycles, quadricycles sagging with heavy loads, empty gigantic produce carts that would come back again filled before the sun was setting, all with the throbbing engines and noiseless wheels and a perpetual wild melody of horns and gongs. Along the very verge of the outermost way our young people went in silence, newly wed and oddly shy of one another's company. Many were the things shouted to them as they tramped along, for in 2100 a foot passenger on an English road was almost as strange a sight as a motor car would have been in 1800. But they went on with steadfast eyes into the country, paying no heed to such cries. Before them in the south rose the downs, blue at first, and as they came nearer, changing to green, surmounted by the row of gigantic windwheels that supplemented the windwheels upon the roof spaces of the city, and broken and restless with long morning shadows of those whirling vanes. By midday they had come so near that they could see here and there little patches of pallid dots, the sheep the meat department of the food company owned. In another hour they had passed the clay and the root crops and the single fence that hedged them in, and the prohibition against trespass no longer held. The leveled roadway plunged into a cutting with all its traffic, and they could leave it and walk over the green sward and up the open hillside. Never had these children of the latter days been together in such a lonely place. They were both very hungry and footsore, for walking was a rare exercise, and presently they sat down on the weedless, close-cropped grass and looked back for the first time at the city from which they had come, shining wide and splendid in the blue haze of the valley of the Thames. Elizabeth was a little afraid of the unenclosed sheep away up the slope. She had never been near big, unrestrained animals before, but Denton reassured her, and overhead a white-winged bird circled in the blue. They talked but little until they had eaten, and then their tongues were loosened. He spoke of the happiness that was now certainly theirs, of the folly of not breaking sooner out of that magnificent prison of latter-day life, of the old romantic days that had passed from the world forever. And then he became boastful. He took up the sword that lay on the ground beside him, and she took it from his hand and ran a tremulous finger along the blade. "And you could," she said, "you could raise this and strike a man?" "Why not, if there were need?" "But," she said, "it would seem so horrible. It would slash. There would be." Her voice sank. "Blood." "In the old romances you have read often enough." "Oh, I know in those, yes. But that is different. One knows it is not blood, just a sort of red ink. And you killing?" She looked at him doubtfully, and then handed him back the sword. After they had rested and eaten, they rose up and went on their way towards the hills. They passed quite close to a huge flock of sheep, who stared and bleated at their unaccustomed figures. She had never seen sheep before, and she shivered to think such gentle things must needs be slain for food. A sheepdog barked from a distance, and then a shepherd appeared amidst the supports of the windwheels and came down towards them. When he drew near, he called out, asking whither they were going. Denton hesitated and told him briefly that they sought some ruined house among the downs in which they might live together. He tried to speak in an offhand manner, as though it was a usual thing to do. The man stared incredulously. "Have you done anything?" he asked. "Nothing," said Denton. "Only we don't want to live in the city any longer. Why should we live in cities?" The shepherd stared more incredulously than ever. "You can't live here," he said. "We mean to try." The shepherd stared from one to the other. "You'll go back tomorrow," he said. "It looks pleasant enough in the sunlight. Are you sure you've done nothing? We shepherds are not such great friends of the police." Denton looked at him steadfastly. "No," he said, "but we are too poor to live in the city, and we can't bear the thought of wearing clothes of blue canvas and doing drudgery. We are going to live a simple life here, like the people of old." The shepherd was a bearded man with a thoughtful face. He glanced at Elizabeth's fragile beauty. "They had simple minds," he said. "So have we," said Denton. The shepherd smiled. "If you go along here," he said, "along the crest beneath the windwheels, you will see a heap of mounds and ruins on your right-hand side. That was once a town called Epsom. There are no houses there, and the bricks have been used for a sheep pen. Go on, and another heap on the edge of the root land is Leatherhead, and then the hill turns away along the border of a valley, and there are woods of beech. Keep along the crest. You will come to quite wild places. In some parts, in spite of all the weeding that is done, ferns and bluebells and other such useless plants are growing still. And through it all, underneath the windwheels, runs a straight lane paved with stones, a roadway of the Romans 2,000 years old. Go to the right of that, down into the valley, and follow it along by the banks of the river. You'll come presently to a street of houses, many with roofs still sound upon them. There you may find shelter." They thanked him. "But it's a quiet place. There's no light after dark there, and I have heard tell of robbers. It is lonely. Nothing happens there. The phonographs of the storytellers, the kinematograph entertainments, the news machines, none of them are to be found there. If you are hungry, there is no food. If you are ill, no doctor." He stopped. "We shall try it," said Denton, moving to go on. Then a thought struck him, and he made an agreement with the shepherd, and learnt where they might find him to buy and bring them anything of which they stood in need out of the city. And in the evening they came to a deserted village. With its houses that seemed so small and odd to them, they found it golden in the glory of the sunset and desolate and still. They went from one deserted house to another, marveling at their quaint simplicity and debating which they should choose. And at last, in a sunlit corner of a room that had lost its outer wall, they came upon a wildflower, a little flower of blue that the weeders of the food company had overlooked. That house they decided upon, but they did not remain in it long that night, because they were resolved to feast upon nature. And moreover, the houses became very gaunt and shadowy after the sunlight had faded out of the sky. So after they had rested a little time, they went to the crest of the hill again to see with their own eyes the silence of heaven set with stars, about which the old poets had had so many things to tell. It was a wonderful sight, and Denton talked like the stars, and when they went down the hill at last, the sky was pale with dawn. They slept but little, and in the morning when they woke, a thrush was singing in a tree. So these young people of the 22nd century began their exile. That morning they were very busy exploring the resources of this new home in which they were going to live the simple life. They did not explore very fast or very far, because they went everywhere hand in hand, but they found the beginnings of some furniture. Beyond the village was a store of winter fodder for the sheep of the food company, and Denton dragged great armfuls to the house to make a bed, and in several of the houses were old fungus-eaten chairs and tables, rough, barbaric, clumsy furniture, it seemed to them, and made of wood. They repeated many of the things they had said on the previous day, and towards evening they found another flower, a harebell. In the late afternoon, some company shepherds went down the river valley, riding on a big multicycle, but they hid from them, because their presence, Elizabeth said, seemed to spoil the romance of this old world place altogether. In this fashion they lived a week. For all that week the days were cloudless, and the nights of starry glory, that were invaded each a little more by a crescent moon. Yet something of the first splendor of their coming faded imperceptibly day after day. Denton's eloquence became fitful, and lacked fresh topics of inspiration. The fatigue of their long march from London told in certain stiffness of the limbs, and each suffered from a slight unaccountable cold. Moreover, Denton became aware of unoccupied time. In one place, among the carelessly heaped lumber of the old times, he found a rust-eaten spade, and with this he made a fitful attack on the raised and grass-grown garden. Though he had nothing to plant or sow, he returned to Elizabeth with a sweat-streaming face after half an hour of such work. They were giants in those days, he said, not understanding what want and training will do. And their walk that day led them along the hills until they could see the city shimmering far away in the valley. I wonder how things are going on there, he said. And then came a change in the weather. Come out and see the clouds, she cried, and behold, they were a somber purple in the north and east, streaming up the ragged edges at the zenith. And as they went up the hill, these hurrying streamers blotted out the sunset. Suddenly the wind set the beech trees swaying and whispering, and Elizabeth shivered. And then far away the lightning flashed like a sword that is drawn suddenly, and the distant thunder marched about the sky. And even as they stood astonished, pattering upon them came the first headlong raindrops of the storm. In an instant the last streak of sunset was hidden by a falling curtain of hail, and the lightning flashed again, and the voice of the thunder roared louder, and all about them the world scowled dark and strange. Seizing hands, these children of the city ran down the hill to their home in infinite astonishment, and ere they reached it, Elizabeth was weeping with dismay, and the darkening ground about them was white and brittle and active with the pelting hail. Then began a strange and terrible night for them. For the first time in their civilized lives, they were in absolute darkness. They were wet and cold and shivering, and all about them hissed the hail, and through the long neglected ceilings of the derelict home came noisy spouts of water, and formed pools and rivulets on the creaking floor. As the gusts of the storm struck the worn-out building, it groaned and shuddered, and now a mass of plaster from the wall would slide and smash, and now some loosened tile would rattle down the roof and crash into the empty greenhouse below. Elizabeth shuddered and was still. Denton wrapped his gay and flimsy city cloak about her, and so they crouched in the darkness. And ever the thunder broke louder and nearer, and evermore lurid flashed the lightning, jerking into a momentary gaunt clearness the streaming, dripping room in which they sheltered. Never before had they been in the open air, save when the sun was shining. All their time had been spent in the warm and airy ways and halls and rooms of the latter-day city. It was to them as night is if they were in some other world, some disordered chaos of stress and tumult, and almost beyond hoping that they should ever see the city ways again. The storm seemed to last interminably, until at last they dozed between the thunderclaps, and then very swiftly it fell and ceased. And as the last patter of rain died away, they heard an unfamiliar sound. "What is that?" cried Elizabeth. It came again. It was the barking of dogs. It drove down the desert lane and past, and through the windows, whitening the wall before them, and throwing it upon the shadow of the window frame and of a tree in black silhouette, shone the light of the waxing moon. Just as the pale dawn was drawing the things about them into sight, the fitful barking of dogs came near again, and stopped. They listened. After a pause, they heard the quick pattering of feet seeking round the house, and short half-smothered barks. Then again everything was still. "Shh!" whispered Elizabeth, and pointed to the door of their room. Duncan went halfway towards the door and stood listening. He came back with a face of affected unconcern. "They must be the sheep-dogs of the food company," he said. "They will do us no harm." He sat down again beside her. "What a night it has been," he said. To hide how keenly he was listening. "I don't like dogs," answered Elizabeth after a long silence. "Dogs never hurt anyone," said Denton. "In the old days, in the 19th century, everybody had a dog." "There was a romance I heard once. A dog killed a man." "Not this sort of dog," said Denton confidently. "Some of those romances are exaggerated." Suddenly a half bark, and pattering up the staircase, the sound of panting. Denton sprang to his feet and drew the sword out of the damp straw upon which they had been lying. Then in the doorway appeared a gaunt sheep-dog, and halted there. Behind it stared another. For an instant man and brute faced each other, hesitating. Then Denton, being ignorant of dogs, made a sharp step forward. "Go away," he said, with a clumsy motion of his sword. The dog started and growled. Denton stopped sharply. "Good dog," he said. Then the growling jerked into a bark. "Good dog," said Denton. The second dog growled and barked. A third, out of sight down the staircase, took up the barking also. Outside others gave tongue. A large number, it seemed to Denton. "This is annoying," said Denton, without taking his eyes off the brutes before him. "Of course the shepherds won't come out of the city for hours yet. Naturally, these dogs don't quite make us out." "I can't hear," shouted Elizabeth. She stood up and came to him. Denton tried again, but the barking still drowned out his voice. The sound had a curious effect upon his blood. Odd, disused emotions began to stir. His face changed as he shouted. He tried again. The barking seemed to mock him, and one dog danced a pace forward, bristling. Suddenly he turned, and uttering certain words in a dialect of the underways, words incomprehensible to Elizabeth, he made for the dogs. There was a sudden cessation of the barking, a growl and a snapping. Elizabeth saw the snarling head of the foremost dog, its white teeth and retracted ears, and the flash of the thrust blade. The brute leaped into the air and was flung back. Then Denton, with a shout, was driving the dogs before him. The sword flashed above his head with a sudden new freedom of gesture, and then he vanished down the staircase. She made 6 steps to follow him, and on the landing there was blood. She stopped, and hearing the tumult of dogs and Denton's shouts pass out of the house, ran to the window. 9 wolfish sheep-dogs were scattering. One writhed before the porch, and Denton, tasting that strange delight of combat that slumbers still in the blood of even the most civilized man, was shouting and running across the garden space. And then she saw something that for a moment he did not see. The dog circled round this way and that, and came again. They had him in the open. In an instant she divined the situation. She would have called to him. For a moment she felt sick and helpless, and then, obeying a strange impulse, she gathered up her white skirt and ran downstairs. In the hall was the rusting spade. That was it. She seized it and ran out. She came none too soon. One dog rolled before him, well nigh slashed in half, but a second had him by the thigh, and a third gripped his collar behind, and a fourth had the blade of the sword between its teeth, tasting its own blood. He parried the leap of a fifth with his left arm. It might have been the first century instead of the 22nd, so far as she was concerned. All the gentleness of her 18 years of city life vanished before this primordial need. The spade smote hard and sure, and cleft the dog's skull. Another, crouching for a spring, yelped with dismay at this unexpected antagonist, and rushed aside. 2 wasted precious moments on the binding of a feminine skirt. The collar of Denton's cloak tore and parted as he staggered back, and that dog too felt the spade, and ceased to trouble him. He sheathed his sword in the brute at his thigh. "To the wall!" cried Elizabeth, and in 3 seconds the fight was at an end, and our young people stood side by side, while a remnant of 5 dogs, with ears and tails of disaster, fled shamefully from the stricken field. For a moment they stood panting and victorious, and then Elizabeth, dropping her spade, covered her face and sank to the ground in a paroxysm of weeping. Denton looked about him, thrust the point of his sword into the ground so that it was at hand, and stooped to comfort her. At last their more tumultuous emotions subsided, and they could talk again. She leaned upon the wall, and he sat upon it so that he could keep an eye open for any returning dogs. 2 at any rate were up on the hillside, and kept up a vexatious barking. She was tear-stained, but not very wretched now, because for half an hour he had been repeating that she was brave and had saved his life, but a new fear was growing in her mind. "They are the dogs of the food company," she said. "There will be trouble." "I'm afraid so. Very likely they will prosecute us for trespass." A pause. "In the old times," he said, "this sort of thing happened day after day." "Last night," she said, "I could not live through another such night." He looked at her. Her face was pale for want of sleep, and drawn and haggard. He came to a sudden resolution. "We must go back," he said. She looked at the dead dogs and shivered. "We cannot stay here," she said. "We must go back," he repeated, glancing over his shoulder to see if the enemy kept their distance. "We have been happy for a time, but the world is too civilized. Ours is the age of cities. More of this will kill us." "But what are we to do? How can we live there?" Denton hesitated. His heel kicked against the wall on which he sat. "It's a thing I haven't mentioned before," he said, and coughed, "but—" "Yes?" "You could raise money on your expectations," he said. "Could I?" she said eagerly. "Of course you could. What a child you are!" She stood up, and her face was bright. "And why did you not tell me before?" she asked. "And all this time we have been here." He looked at her for a moment and smiled. Then the smile vanished. "I thought it ought to come from you," he said. "I didn't like to ask for your money, and besides, at first I thought this would be rather fine." There was a pause. "It has been fine," he said, and glanced once more over his shoulder, "until all this began." "Yes," she said, "those first days, the first 3 days." They looked for a space into one another's faces, and then Denton slid down from the wall and took her hand. "To each generation," he said, "the life of its time. I see it all plainly now. In the city That is the life to which we were born. To live in any other fashion, coming here was a dream, and this is the awakening." "It was a pleasant dream," she said, "in the beginning." For a long space neither spoke. "If we would reach the city before the shepherds come here, we must start," said Denton. "We must get our food out of the house and eat as we go." Denton glanced about him again, and giving the dead dogs a wide berth, they walked across the garden space and into the house together. They found the wallet with their food and descended the blood-stained stairs again. In the hall Elizabeth stopped. "1 minute," she said. "There is something here." She led the way into the room in which that one little blue flower was blooming. She stooped to it. She touched it with her hand. "I want it," she said, and then, "I cannot take it." Impulsively she stooped and kissed its petals. Then silently, side by side, they went across the empty garden space into the old high road and set their faces resolutely towards the distant city, towards the complex mechanical city of those latter days, the city that had swallowed up mankind. End of section 9.